This 1859 photo looked peaceful, but zooming in on the slave child's hands changed everything. The photograph sat in a climate-controlled archive at the Virginia Historical Society for over a century before anyone truly looked at it. Measuring 8 by 10 inches, the daguerreotype showed what appeared to be a prosperous family portrait from 1859. A father in a dark suit standing behind his seated wife, both flanked by their well-dressed children. The image had been donated in 1923 by a descendant who claimed it showed her great-great-grandparents on their plantation near Richmond. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian specializing in antebellum Southern photography, first encountered the image during a routine cataloging project in the spring of 2023. She had spent weeks reviewing hundreds of Civil War-era photographs, most of them unremarkable documentation of long-dead families. This one initially seemed no different. A wealthy planter family frozen in time, their formal poses reflecting the rigid photographic conventions of the era. The father, identified in the archive notes as Thomas Hendricks, stood with one hand on his wife's shoulder, his expression stern and unsmiling, as was typical for daguerreotypes that required subjects to remain motionless for several seconds. His wife, Eleanor, wore a dark silk dress with delicate lace collar, her hair pulled back severely. 2 children, a boy around 8 and a girl perhaps 6, stood beside their parents in miniature versions of adult clothing. The boy in a suit with bow tie, the girl in a layered dress with ribbons. What caught Sarah's attention that Tuesday morning wasn't the posed family in the foreground. It was something she almost missed. 2 blurred figures in the background, barely visible, near what appeared to be a garden wall. The photograph's depth of field had rendered them slightly out of focus, as if they were moving during the exposure. She leaned closer to her monitor, adjusting the digital scan's contrast. The background figures became marginally clearer. 2 children, younger than those posed with the family. One wore clothing similar to the Hendricks children, clean and well-fitted. But the other child, darker-skinned and wearing what looked like a simple shift dress, stood in sharp contrast. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't entirely unusual. Many Southern plantation photographs from this era inadvertently captured enslaved people in the background, servants who happened to be present during family portraits. But something about this image felt different, urgent somehow. The 2 children appeared to be playing together, their positions suggesting movement frozen mid-game, a moment of innocent interaction captured accidentally by the camera's indifferent eye. Sarah increased the magnification on her screen, and the background figures became slightly clearer. The 2 children were definitely playing, their body language unmistakable despite the blur. One child, the one in better clothing, held what appeared to be a small wooden toy, perhaps a carved horse or doll. The other child, the darker-skinned one in simpler dress, reached toward the toy with both hands extended, a gesture so universal and timeless, it transcended the decades, a child wanting to join in play. Sarah picked up her phone and called her colleague, Dr. Marcus Washington, a specialist in African American history at Howard University. They had collaborated on several projects examining the lives of enslaved people through photographic evidence, piecing together stories from images that their white subjects never intended to tell. "Marcus, I need another set of eyes on something," she said when he answered. "I'm looking at an 1859 daguerreotype from Virginia, and there's a black child in the background playing with what appears to be a white child. But the composition is unusual, and I want to make sure I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." "Send it over," Marcus replied. She could hear the interest in his voice. "I've got about 20 minutes before my next class." Sarah uploaded a high-resolution scan to their shared drive and waited, finding herself staring at the image again. She zoomed in on different sections, examining every detail. The Hendricks family stared back at her with their formal, frozen expressions, revealing nothing. The father's hand rested possessively on his wife's shoulder. The children's faces held that peculiar stillness required by long exposure times, their eyes slightly glazed from the effort of remaining motionless. Her gaze drifted back to the background. The white child, likely another Hendricks offspring too young to be included in the formal portrait, wore a light-colored dress that caught the available light. The black child's clothing was noticeably simpler, cruder, the fabric appearing coarse even in the photograph's silver-toned rendering. Even in the blur of movement, the difference in their circumstances was stark and deliberate. Her phone buzzed. Marcus had sent a text. "Interesting? Very interesting. Can you get a higher resolution scan of just the background section? I want to see those children more clearly." Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she typed her response. "Already planning to request it. Something about this feels important." Sarah contacted the archive's imaging specialist the next morning, requesting a new scan at the highest possible resolution the equipment could achieve. The original daguerreotype would need to be photographed again using their most advanced digital equipment, a delicate process that required careful handling, specialized lighting, and meticulous scheduling. The specialist, Tom Reynolds, had been working with historical photographs for nearly 20 years and understood the significance of proper documentation. "What are you looking for specifically?" Tom asked, as he made notes about her request. "There are 2 children in the background, slightly out of focus," Sarah explained. "One appears to be an enslaved child. I need to see every detail visible in that section. Clothing, positioning, anything that might tell us more about who she was." Tom nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I can prioritize this. Give me 3 days to work it into the schedule and set up the equipment properly. If there's detail to be found, we'll find it. 3 days felt like 3 weeks. Sarah tried to focus on other projects, but her mind kept returning to the photograph, to those two children frozen mid-play in the background of someone else's formal portrait. She found herself wondering about the darker-skinned child. How old was she? What was her name? Did she survive the war? Did she live to see freedom? When Tom's email finally arrived, Sarah was in a meeting with graduate students. She excused herself, perhaps too abruptly, and hurried back to her office. She downloaded the files with hands that trembled slightly, her coffee growing cold and forgotten on her desk as she opened the enhanced scans. The archive had provided multiple images, full-frame shots, and several detailed sections captured at extreme magnification, each file labeled with precise coordinates indicating which portion of the original photograph it represented. Sarah took a breath and opened the file labeled Background Detail de 1 Children TIFF. The image filled her screen and her breath caught in her throat. At this resolution, the blurred figures resolved into heartbreaking clarity. The two children were indeed playing, captured in a moment of innocent interaction that transcended race and circumstance. The white child, a girl around 5 or 6, held a small carved wooden horse, its details now visible, crude but charming, probably made by one of the plantation's craftsmen. The black child, slightly smaller and wearing a threadbare dress that ended well above her knees, reached toward the toy with both small hands, extended in unmistakable longing. But it wasn't the toy that made Sarah's hands shake as she adjusted the image contrast and brightness. It wasn't the children's poses or their clothing, or even the poignant contrast between them. It was the black child's wrists, now clearly visible in the enhanced scan. Even in the slight blur of motion, even across more than 160 years of time, the marks were absolutely unmistakable. Sarah sat motionless, staring at the enhanced image on her screen. The marks on the child's wrists were exactly what she feared they were. Circular scarring, dark against darker skin, encircling both small wrists like terrible bracelets. The scars formed complete rings, their regularity leaving no doubt about their origin. These weren't accidental injuries or random wounds. They were the deliberate result of sustained restraint, of metal or leather worn so consistently, so tightly, that it had left permanent marks on skin that should have known only gentleness. Sarah had seen similar markings before, in medical photographs and drawings documenting the physical trauma of slavery, evidence of shackles or manacles worn by adults attempting to escape, by field workers being punished, by people deemed dangerous or rebellious. But this child couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. What possible justification could there be for shackling someone barely out of infancy? She picked up her phone with trembling fingers and called Marcus again. When he answered, she could barely keep her voice steady. "Marcus, I got the high-resolution scans. This child..." She paused, collecting herself. "This child was shackled, regularly, consistently enough to leave permanent scarring. She can't be more than 4 or 5 years old in this photograph." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. "Send me the images. All of them." Sarah shared the enhanced scans through their secure drive, then waited while Marcus examined them. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel his reaction through the phone connection. After several minutes, his face appeared on her screen. He'd switched to video call. His expression was grim, his jaw clenched. "How old would these scars be at the time of the photograph?" he asked quietly, his professional training overriding his emotional response. Sarah had already been considering this question. Based on the apparent degree of healing, the darkness and definition of the scar tissue, and the way they've integrated into the surrounding skin, I'd estimate these injuries were sustained over months or even years before this picture was taken. The scarring is well established, not recent, which means... She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Which means this child might have been restrained since she was 2 or 3 years old." Marcus finished, his voice hollow. "Maybe even younger." They sat in silence for a moment, both historians who had spent careers studying slavery's brutalities, yet still capable of being shocked by new evidence of its cruelty. "But why?" Sarah finally asked. "A child that young can't effectively run away, can't do a heavy labor, can't pose any real threat. So why would anyone shackle a toddler?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Control, conditioning, starting the process of breaking them young, or..." He paused, his expression darkening further. "Or maybe she was kept close to the main house, and they didn't want her interfering with the white children." Whoa. Sarah began her deep research that same afternoon, driven by a need to give this anonymous child a name, a story, some restoration of the humanity that had been denied her. She started with what little documentation existed in the Virginia Historical Society's files about the photograph itself. The donor, Margaret Hendricks, had been 73 years old in 1923 when she contributed several family items including the daguerreotype. A brief archival note indicated she was the daughter of Thomas Hendricks Jr., the 8-year-old boy standing in the photograph, making her the granddaughter of the couple pictured. But Margaret had provided frustratingly minimal information about the photograph itself. No identification of which children were pictured, no explanation of the setting or occasion, no mention whatsoever of anyone beyond the immediate family. Just a simple, sterile notation in her careful handwriting. Family portrait, circa 1859, Richmond area. The enslaved child in the background, reaching for a toy with scarred wrists, hadn't even registered as worthy of mention. Sarah expanded her search to census records, starting with the 1860 census, the last comprehensive population count taken before the Civil War tore the nation apart. She found Thomas Hendricks easily enough in the Virginia records. The census listed him as a tobacco planter, age 42, with property valued at $45,000, a substantial fortune for the time, equivalent to well over $1 million today. His wife Eleanor was listed as 38 years old. 5 children were recorded in their household: Thomas Jr., age 10, William 8, Elizabeth 6, Mary 5, and Robert, just 2 years old. Then came the slave schedule, a separate census document that listed enslaved people by age, gender, and sometimes occupation, but almost never by name. The dehumanization was built into the very structure of the record keeping. White families received names, ages, relationships, and property values, while enslaved people were reduced to demographic data points. The Hendricks household owned 37 enslaved people according to the 1860 schedule. Sarah scanned the list methodically. 3 women in their 20s, 2 men in their 30s, several teenagers, multiple children of various ages, 3 infants. One entry made her pause, her finger hovering over the screen. Female, mulatto, 3 years. Could this be the child in the photograph? The age roughly aligned. If she was 3 years old in June 1860 when the census was taken, she would have been approximately 4 in 1859 when the photograph was made. The designation mulatto indicated mixed racial heritage, which might explain why she appeared to be kept close to the main house rather than in the quarters with field workers. But the slave schedule gave no names, no physical descriptions, nothing that could definitively identify this 3-year-old girl as the child with the scarred wrists reaching for a toy. Sarah needed more. Plantation records, account books, personal correspondence, anything that might list enslaved people by name and provide details about their lives and treatment. She contacted the Library of Virginia, carefully explaining her research project and its significance. Did they have any records from the Hendricks plantation? Papers, letters, account books, anything that might have survived the chaos of the Civil War and the subsequent 160 years? The response came 2 days later, and Sarah's heart leaped when she read it. Yes, they had a small collection of Hendricks family papers, donated in the 1970s by a distant relative cleaning out an old estate. The collection wasn't large, but it included several plantation account books from the 1850s. The Hendricks papers filled 3 archival boxes, a modest collection that had somehow survived the chaos of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and 15 decades of family moves and estate settlements. Sarah drove to Richmond on a gray Monday morning in early April, the dogwoods just beginning to bloom along the highway. She signed the visitor log at the Library of Virginia, presented her credentials, and requested the Hendricks collection with hands that shook slightly from a mixture of anticipation and dread. The first box contained mostly business correspondence, letters about tobacco prices, shipping arrangements, contracts with merchants in Richmond and Norfolk, complaints about tariffs and transportation costs. Sarah skimmed these quickly, finding them mundane and impersonal, the ordinary business of a plantation economy built on extraordinary injustice. She was looking for anything that mentioned the household itself, the daily operations, the people enslaved there. The second box held what she'd been hoping for: plantation account books. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully opened the first ledger, its leather binding cracked and worn, its pages yellowed but still legible. The dates ran from 1855 to 1860, exactly the period she needed. Here, finally, were names. Lists of enslaved people with their assigned tasks, their clothing allowances, their ages, the resources allocated to their maintenance. She found the household section and began reading carefully, her eyes adjusting to the faded ink and cramped 19th century handwriting. Bess, age 28. Cook, Samuel, age 32. Blacksmith, Rose, age 24. House servant, Eliza, age 19. Spinner. Margaret, age 16. Laundress. Sarah continued down the list, her heart beating faster as she moved through the names. Then she found the children's section. Clara, age 10, learning to spin. Joseph, age 8, stable work. Daniel, age 7, yard work. Ruth, age 4, Ruth. The name seemed to jump off the page. Age 4 in 1859, exactly right. Sarah continued reading the notation beside Ruth's name, written in the same matter-of-fact hand that had cataloged tobacco shipments and equipment purchases. House servant, special duties. Mother, Rose. What special duties would a 4-year-old have? The phrase felt ominous, euphemistic. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she continued through the ledger, looking for additional references to Ruth. Several entries documented clothing allowances, 2 shifts per year, 1 pair of shoes. But Ruth's clothing allowance was consistently smaller than other children her age, and a note indicated shoes unnecessary, indoor service only. Medical expenses appeared in a separate section. Most entries were mundane: treatment for fever, a broken finger, a difficult childbirth. but scattered among them were entries that made Sarah's blood run cold. Ruth, treatment for wrist inflammation, $2. Ruth, salve for skin irritation, $1.50. Ruth, wrist treatment, $2. Wrist inflammation. Skin irritation. The clinical language barely concealed what it described. Sarah photographed each page with her phone, her anger growing with each entry. She continued through the ledger, finding scattered references to Ruth throughout the years, 1856 to 1860. In September 1857, an entry in the equipment and supplies section noted, "Leather restraints ordered from Richmond, small size, $8. Sarah had to set the ledger down and step away, fighting the wave of nausea and rage that swept over her. Leather restraints, small size, for a child who would have been 2 years old in September 1857. Sarah forced herself to continue reading, documenting everything methodically despite the emotional toll. She needed to understand Ruth's full story, to piece together the fragmented evidence of this child's life from the cold, bureaucratic records that reduced human suffering to ledger entries and supply costs. She found more scattered references as she worked through the remaining documents. A letter from Thomas Hendricks to a supplier in Richmond, dated March 1858, inquired about restraints suitable for a young child, well-made and durable. The supplier's response, preserved in the files, recommended soft leather with brass fittings, which will cause less damage to the skin while still providing adequate security. Less damage to the skin, as if the goal was simply to minimize the physical evidence of what was being done, not to question whether it should be done at all. The third box contained more personal correspondence, including several letters between Eleanor Hendricks and her sister Caroline, who lived in Charleston. Sarah read through these carefully, looking for any mention of household affairs or the enslaved people who maintained the Hendricks home. Most of the letters discussed social visits, church activities, child-rearing advice, and family news. Then, in a letter dated August 1858, she found what she'd been looking for, a passage that provided chilling context for everything she'd discovered in the account books. Eleanor's elegant handwriting filled the page with news about her children's health, the summer heat, and then Thomas insists on maintaining strict discipline even among the youngest servants, which I confess troubles my maternal sensibilities. Little Ruth, Rose's daughter, had developed an unfortunate habit of wandering from her duties and interfering with the children's activities, inserting herself into their games and play, reaching for their toys, generally making a nuisance of herself. After several unsuccessful corrections, Thomas determined that physical restraints during her working hours would teach proper boundaries and respect for her station. The child has adjusted to this arrangement, though our physician, Dr. Morrison, had to treat some skin irritation where the leather rubbed. Such measures seem harsh to my feminine sensibilities, but Thomas assures me this is standard practice for training difficult servants from a young age, and that early discipline prevents greater problems later. He says I am too soft-hearted where the servants' children are concerned. Sarah read the passage 3 times, each reading making her feel physically ill. The euphemistic language, unfortunate habit of wandering, unsuccessful corrections, proper boundaries, adjusted to this arrangement, barely concealed what had actually happened. A toddler, naturally curious and playful as all children are, had been shackled for the crime of wanting to play with the other children in the household, for wanting to be a child. The photograph suddenly took on devastating new meaning. That moment captured in the background wasn't just 2 children playing. It was Ruth, briefly free of her restraints, reaching toward a toy, toward play, toward a childhood she wasn't allowed to have. And those scars, visible on her wrists, were the permanent record of her punishment for that natural, innocent desire. Sarah sat in the archive reading room for a long time after finishing the Hendricks papers, trying to process what she'd learned. Other researchers worked quietly around her, oblivious to the story she'd just uncovered. Finally, she gathered her materials, thanked the archivist, and drove back to her university office in a daze. She called Marcus that evening and shared everything she'd found, the account books, the letters, the medical records, the evidence that systematically documented the abuse of a child young enough to still be learning to speak. They decided to write a joint article documenting Ruth's story and the photograph's significance, but Sarah wanted more than just an academic paper read by a few hundred specialists. This story needed to reach people, needed to make them understand what slavery meant in human terms, and the life of one small child whose only crime was wanting to play. But first, Sarah needed to know what happened to Ruth after 1860, where the plantation records ended. The Civil War erupted in April 1861, just 2 years after the photograph was taken. Everything would have changed then, the orderly record-keeping of the plantation system disrupted by war, invasion, and eventually collapse. Sarah searched through wartime records, looking for any mention of the Hendricks plantation or its enslaved population. She found that Thomas Hendricks had enlisted in the Confederate Army in the summer of 1861, commissioned as a captain in a Virginia regiment. He served for about a year before being discharged in September 1862 due to health problems. The records mentioned chronic dyspepsia and nervous exhaustion. The plantation continued operating under Eleanor's management until 1865, when Union forces occupied Richmond and the surrounding areas. Emancipation came to Virginia gradually and chaotically. Enslaved people in areas under Union control were technically freed by military order, while those in Confederate-held territory remained in bondage until the war's end. Sarah searched the Freedmen's Bureau records, the federal agency established to assist formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction, looking for any mention of people from the Hendricks plantation. The Freedmen's Bureau records for Richmond were extensive but disorganized. Thousands of names documented as formerly enslaved people registered with the Bureau seeking assistance, work contracts, family reunification help, or educational opportunities. Sarah spent hours scrolling through digitized records, searching for names she recognized from the plantation ledgers. Then she found it, a registration form dated July 1866. Rose, age 30, formerly enslaved by Thomas Hendricks of Richmond, registered along with her daughter Ruth, age 11. Both had remained in the Richmond area after emancipation. Rose's occupation was listed as laundress. Ruth's entry noted she was attending a school established by the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Missionary Society. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, relief, joy, and lingering sorrow mixing together in a way that left her emotionally exhausted. Ruth had survived. The 4-year-old in the photograph, shackled for wanting to play, had lived to see freedom, had lived to go to school, to learn to read, to have opportunities her mother never had. Sarah continued following Ruth's trail through the decades of Reconstruction and beyond, piecing together a life from scattered census records, city directories, and other documentary fragments. The 1870 census showed Ruth, now age 15, still living with Rose in Richmond. Ruth's occupation was listed as domestic servant, but notably, she was also recorded as being able to read and write, a remarkable achievement for someone born into slavery, denied education, marked by childhood trauma. The 1880 census revealed more of Ruth's story. Now 25 years old, she was married to a man named James Parker, a carpenter. They had 2 children, a daughter, Mary, age 4, and a son, David, age 2. The family lived in a modest house in Richmond's Jackson Ward neighborhood, an area that was becoming a center of African-American life and business in the city. Ruth's occupation was listed as seamstress. She had learned a skilled trade that gave her some economic independence. Sarah found a city directory entry from 1885 that listed Ruth Parker, dressmaker, with a business address separate from her home. She had established her own small business, serving both black and white clients in an era when such entrepreneurship required tremendous courage and skill. The 1900 census was the last in which Sarah could definitively identify Ruth. She was 45 years old, widowed. James had apparently died sometime in the 1890s, and living with her daughter Mary and 3 grandchildren. Her occupation was still listed as seamstress, and the census indicated she owned her home, a significant achievement in the Jim Crow South. After 1900, the trail grew cold. Ruth would have been in her 60s during World War I, possibly her 70s in the 1920s, when the photograph was donated to the Historical Society by Thomas Hendricks Jr.'s daughter. Sarah wondered if Ruth had known about that donation, if she'd even known the photograph existed. Had she remembered that day in 1859, playing briefly with the Hendricks children? Did she ever speak to her own children and grandchildren about the scars on her wrists? Sarah and Marcus worked together for months, preparing their article for publication in the Journal of Southern History, but they also wanted to reach beyond academic circles. They collaborated with a documentary filmmaker to create a short video examining the photograph and telling Ruth's story. The video used the enhanced digital scans, slowly zooming in on those scarred wrists, while a narrator explained what the evidence revealed about slavery's impact on the youngest victims. The video was released on YouTube and immediately began spreading across social media platforms. Within a week, it had been viewed over 1 million times. Within a month, that number had grown to 10 million. The comments section filled with expressions of shock, grief, anger, and belated recognition of slavery's everyday cruelties. "I've studied the Civil War for 20 years and never really thought about enslaved children this young," one comment read. "This photograph changes everything I thought I understood." Another wrote, "My daughter is 4 years old. I cannot imagine anyone putting chains on her wrists. The evil of this is incomprehensible." The response to their work overwhelmed Sarah and Marcus. News outlets picked up the story, running features about the photograph and Ruth's life. Several descendants of the Hendricks family contacted Sarah, some expressing shame and horror about their ancestors' actions, others offering family documents that might contain additional information about enslaved people on the plantation. One woman, a great-great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Hendricks Jr., sent a heartfelt letter apologizing for her ancestors' cruelty and asking how she might contribute to racial justice organizations in Virginia. But the most meaningful contact came 3 months after the video's release. A woman named Patricia Johnson reached out through the university's website, explaining that she had seen the video and recognized the name Ruth from her own family history. Her great-great-grandmother had been named Ruth, born into slavery around 1855 in the Richmond area, with a mother named Rose, who worked as a laundress after emancipation. Sarah and Patricia arranged to meet in Richmond, both bringing their respective documentation to a conference room at the Virginia Historical Society, the same institution that had preserved the photograph for over a century without truly seeing it. They spread their materials across the table, Sarah's research files, census records, and enhanced photograph scans, Patricia's family Bible with birth and death dates, old photographs, and stories passed down through 5 generations. The evidence aligned perfectly. Patricia's great-great-grandmother Ruth had been born in 1855, enslaved by a tobacco planter named Hendricks, freed in 1865, married to James Parker, worked as a seamstress, lived in Jackson Ward. It was the same Ruth. The child in the photograph was Patricia's ancestor. My grandmother told us stories about Ruth, Patricia said quietly, handling a photograph from the 1890s that showed an older Ruth standing with her daughter and grandchildren. She said Ruth never talked much about slavery, but she had scars on her wrists that she always kept covered. Ruth would only say they were from before freedom, and that she didn't want to remember. She wore long sleeves even in summer. Sarah looked at the photograph Patricia had brought. Ruth, in her 40s, standing straight and dignified in front of her home, her expression serene but guarded. She wore a high-necked dress with long sleeves, despite what appeared to be warm weather, her hands folded carefully in front of her. She made sure all her children learned to read, Patricia continued. My grandmother said Ruth was obsessed with education. She worked extra hours to pay for books and school supplies, insisted that her children attend school no matter how much work needed to be done at home. Now I understand why. She knew what it meant to be denied even the smallest freedoms. Education meant her children would have choices she never had. Together, Sarah and Patricia worked with the Virginia Historical Society to create a new exhibition titled Invisible No More, Seeing the Enslaved in Family Portraits. The show featured the Hendricks photograph prominently, but now it was accompanied by the enhanced details showing Ruth's scarred wrists, excerpts from the plantation records and Eleanor's letters, and the later photograph of Ruth with her family. The exhibition also included several other daguerreotypes from the eras in which enslaved people appeared in the backgrounds of white family portraits, each one now researched and documented, the anonymous figures given names and stories. The exhibition opened in October 2024, exactly 165 years after the original photograph was taken. Patricia attended, standing beside Sarah as visitors moved slowly through the gallery. Many people stopped for a long time in front of Ruth's photograph, reading the accompanying text, some wiping away tears. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip stood silently, staring at the image of a child their own age in shackles. My great-great-grandmother told her children that freedom meant choosing your own path, Patricia said as they watched the visitors. She told them that the most important thing was to never let anyone tell them who they had to be, what they had to accept. She built a life for herself after slavery, learned a trade, owned her home, raised children who could read and write. She turned pain into purpose. Sarah nodded, thinking about Ruth at 4 years old, reaching for a toy with scarred wrists, and Ruth at 45, making sure her grandchildren had the education and opportunities she'd been denied. The photograph that had sat unexamined in an archive for over a century now told a story that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Ruth's scars bore witness to slavery's cruelty, but her survival and her descendants' thriving bore witness to resilience, determination, and hope. The image that had once rendered her invisible, a mere background detail in someone else's family portrait, now ensured she would never be forgotten, her humanity restored, her story told, her strength honored.